In this video, I'm going to look in detail at the final build phase of my UTMB training. So anyone who's followed the channel for a little while will know that my UTMB training consists of 4 distinct phases. The first of which was a kind of base period, looking at stability in that kind of area. Then there was the strength phase, then the specific preparation phase, and then the final phase is the taper. So I've already talked about the first 2 phases in a previous video. I'll put a link to that up there. And now looking at the kind of specific, the competition phase of training. And that was very much focusing on strength and conditioning, which was power workouts, and also increasing the distance of my longest run and making the runs more relevant to the race itself. Having the 3 distinct phases is so that I could slowly build up the amount of volume that I was doing and make it more specific at every phase for the race that I'm actually focusing on. If I was to start with my competition phase, the final phase, and just been doing that week after week since the 4th of February, which is when I started my specific training, then it wouldn't have worked because I would have burned out. There would have been too much training at that kind of level. The volume would have been too much, and it's also about making sure I had a good base and then slowly building up from that. So the key characteristics of this final competition phase, we're looking at power within the strength and conditioning element. It was working on steady state runs for my typically midweek higher intensity efforts, so that wasn't going above lactate threshold but staying around heart rate zone 4 in the heart rate model which I use, and then increasing the length of my long runs and making them more specific to the race itself. So that involved carrying all the mandatory race kit and getting used to that, and also basically doing dress rehearsals of wearing the same gear, the same clothes that I'm going to wear on race day. Looking at the detail of how that's actually materialized and what that means in terms of volume of training. First off, looking at training stress score. So this is a calculation based on the duration and intensity of the runs. And as you can see on screen now, the actual training stress score increased pretty significantly. My 4 biggest weeks in terms of training stress score were all in this final phase of training. And as you can see, 3 of them were quite a large step increase. Now, due to a slight injury, it wasn't 1 week on, 1 week off as I originally planned. You can see that there's kind of 2 lower weeks there, and then the final week was slightly higher, but not as high as the previous ones. And that's purely because it was getting too close to the race for me to have another really high training stress score week. So that's why the final build week there is slightly lower than it would have been if it had been the previous week. That's the rationale for that. As you can see, the actual training stress score is significantly higher than the base phase and also the strength phase. And as I said, that's just getting more specific to the race itself. Now, looking at what caused that significant increase in training stress, first off, looking at total distance run per week, you can see that the 4 biggest weeks in terms of distance were all again in this final competition phase, so getting more specific. And one of the main reasons for that actual increase in total distance was down to the distance of the longest run that I completed in each of those weeks. Now, this is looking at time of the longest run, which is a metric I tend to use rather than distance, because depending on the elevation and things like that, that will vary it. But looking at this graph, you can see that there's a significant element which is all made up from those longest runs. So there's a couple there which were over 10 hours on 2 different occasions that I did 10-hour runs as part of the training, right at the start of the competition phase, and then one again towards the end of it. And that really is just one of the key reasons why the training stress score was so much higher during the competition phase. The other element is also down to the total elevation per week, so the amount of climbing that I did. And looking at this graph, again, it is an increase, but not to the same extent actually as some of the others. You can see the 3 biggest, in terms of highest amount of climbing, were in the competition phase, but actually then in the strength phase there was quite a lot. And the reason why there's some significant climbing in the strength phase was due to specific hill workouts I was doing at that period. That's why there's a bit more climbing than in the final couple of weeks of the training. However, the average ascent over this period was over 3,400 meters of climbing, and towards the end nearly every week was actually higher than that. Another interesting graph to look at is time in heart rate zone, and although there is the odd flaw here when the heart rate monitor picks up cadence, so it's giving you a very high heart rate reading, overall you can see that there was higher intensity, the darker red colours in the earlier stages of the training, and then less of the really sort of dark red colours in the competition phase. So it was quite a lot of time spent in heart rate zone 3 and 4, but very little actually spent above lactate threshold in the final few weeks. And you can see the actual time in heart rate zone 1 and heart rate zone 2 is significant in the final few weeks there. And again, that's just reflective of getting more specific for the race. I'm not going to be running in heart rate zone 4 and 5 during the race. I will be spending most of the time in heart rate zone 1 and 2, so therefore that's where most of my training has been. However, I've still included some higher intensity efforts in that heart rate zone 4 to get the body developing some lactate and increasing my ability to utilise that and ensure that I'm still efficient when it comes to that kind of intensity. So when I'm doing, say, a steep climb at high altitude, then the heart rate will rise, so I need to do some training at that specific intensity. That's why there is still some darker colours. And that will carry on through the taper period as well. I'm not going to drop all my higher intensity efforts in the next few weeks. There will be some of those included as well. The final graph I'll go through is my peak pace by various distance. So this is looking at my fastest run at different distances. And the shaded blue area was up until the end of June, and then the grey areas from the 1st of July. And what you can see here is that the very short distances, I haven't hit my max pace since the 1st of July, and that's because I haven't been doing those very short, high intensity intervals. All of them have been longer. However, what is encouraging as we look at slightly longer distances from 5k, 10k, 15k, all of my fastest times have been set since the 1st of July. So that's showing that although I'm not doing the very, very short, high intensity stuff, when it's come to the sort of medium to longer distances, I'm actually getting faster, which is really encouraging. The one which kind of stands out as not being a faster time is the marathon, and that's purely down to the fact that I haven't actually run a relatively flat marathon since July. All my long runs have been very mountainous, as you saw by the elevation change, whereas that one in the first half of the year was on a flatter course, which is why the marathon time is quicker. But from 5k all the way up to 50k, apart from marathon distance, I've ran faster in the last month and a bit, which is really encouraging because it shows that the training's working well and that I'm peaking at the right time. In the last week, when I was doing steady state runs, I actually set, second, third fastest 5k times of all time, which is quite rare for me to be running at that speed, so that's a real benefit and a real boost to me. So overall, training went pretty well. There was the odd week where I had to reduce it, as you saw on the training stress score graph. I wasn't able to do one big week, one easy week, one big week, one easy week. There was that period where I had 2 easy weeks. However, as a result of that, I was able to do a 10-hour run because I had 3 days off and felt very well rested. So I was able to do a very big run that week to make up some of the lost training, but overall the distance was down and the training stress score was down. I'm now in the final phase, the taper phase of the UTMB training, and that will see an overall reduction in volume and also an overall reduction in time spent at intensity. As I mentioned, there will be some intensity still in there, especially in the first week of taper. The taper phase is also the shortest of the 4 phases. It's only 3 weeks long, and that has worked well for me in the past. It's a very personal thing, tapering. Some people prefer a longer period, some prefer shorter. For me, I find around 3 weeks works pretty well. And at the end of the competition phase, I was feeling quite sore. The last few long runs I was doing were pretty difficult. The legs were feeling very heavy, so it was definitely time for the taper to begin, which was again quite encouraging because I won't be feeling that I need to be doing any more than what I've planned out, which is great. I hope you found this video useful. If you have, please make sure you give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. Also, if you'd like to receive the TMR Coaching newsletter, please make sure you subscribe to that using the link to my website down below and fill in the sign up form. And I'll see you next time.